So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 46.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And Egypt in the scriptures is always used as a type of the world. And like these Hebrews, we too need to live our lives separated from the world like they did. And we're not to get caught up with the things of our neighbor in the world. We're not to get caught up with their different types of beliefs and their different types of idolatry. We're not to adopt their thinking, the world's way of life, but we're to use the thinking from our kingdom. While we're in this world, we need to look at the world from heaven's view, and that view is only found in the Bible. And we're also not to mix our view. We're not to mix our view with the world's view. In the world, well, they think that our thinking is unclean. They think that we're unclean in our thinking. And so they think of us just like they thought the shepherds were, like how the shepherds were unclean to the Egyptians. But we're not unclean. They're really the ones who are unclean. And they will never please the God of heaven until they change their minds and they repent, just like we did. And so now Jacob, he blesses the Pharaoh. And you have to realize that this Pharaoh, he's only meeting Jacob because of his love for Joseph. Because he would never allow this dirty, old, craggy shepherd to be touching him. But here, he allows it. And the Pharaoh here, he would be thinking that he's the greatest man in the whole kingdom of Egypt. Because he's actually convinced and he considers himself to be a god. But the truth is that the lesser is always blessed by the greater. And from heaven's view, from God's view, Jacob is the greater. And even though he's old, and even though he's a shepherd, and even though he's blind. And so now we read that Egypt is the only place with any food. And Pharaoh, he doesn't give the food to the people. He sells it to them. And Pharaoh, by selling the food, he gets all the money, not only in Egypt, but in all the land of Canaan. And at this time, money, it wasn't coins like we would think. They're just bags of silver and bags of gold because the world hasn't started to use coins yet. And then Pharaoh, he ends up with all the cattle because the Egyptians traded all their cattle for bread. But the truth is that they wouldn't have been able to sustain their cattle anyways because there was no grain to feed them. The only person who had grain was the Pharaoh. But for Jacob's family, Joseph provided for them. He supported them. So here we have Pharaoh, and he's getting rich. And there's nothing left for these people to sell, and there's nothing for them to trade. And all they have left is their lives, their very own bodies and their lands. So Pharaoh buys them, and all the people, they sell themselves to survive. And they all become Pharaoh's slaves. And so all the land becomes Pharaoh's, except for that little bit of land that was owned by the priest. And this is actually an archaeological fact because they have records that they have found. And up to the 18th dynasty, there were records of private land ownership in Egypt. But after the 18th dynasty, they couldn't find any. So now Pharaoh, he will control everything. And so Joseph, he sets up this economic system that will be fair and it will be acceptable to the people of Egypt. And this system had to have been started really close to the very last year of the famine, because his deal is that the Pharaoh would give the people seed for planting, but that he would require 1/5 or 20% of the produce. And Joseph, he wouldn't be giving them seeds to waste. So that means that this has to be the last year of the famine. And this basically translates into having a 20% tax, which seems to be a reasonable price to pay to be able to live. And that's a lot less than we ever pay in taxes. And all of this is managed by Joseph. And so Joseph, he creates this fair and stable society in Egypt. But what you have to see here is that God is not only changing Israel, which he is, and how they function, but he's also changing Egypt, and he's changing Egyptian society. And he's giving this Pharaoh's dynasty more power and more authority than they've ever had. And this will all show up again when we get to the book of Exodus. And so now, after the famine, and it's been about 12 years past the famine, and in verse 27, it says, Israel. And when it uses Israel here, this is the first time the name Israel is not being used for Jacob personally. This is the first time it's being used to describe the descendants of Israel, the people of Israel. And it says of how they've been prospering and growing as a nation for the past 17 years. And then Jacob, he calls his son Joseph to come visit him, because although he's not sick yet, he knows that he's getting closer to the time he will die, because he knows it's inevitable because of his age. And this is really important to Jacob. And he's picking Joseph to take care of all of his funeral arrangements. And by Jacob picking Joseph, it's showing that Jacob, he's rejected Reuben as the firstborn. And it also shows that he's rejected all the other sons, because here he is giving Joseph the duty of the firstborn son. And for Jacob, his funeral and his burial is very important, because this will be his last witness to the Egyptians and to all those Canaanite tribes that were left up there in the land of Canaan. And it will show them that even after being in Egypt for 17 years, he is not of Egypt, and that he is not an idolater, and that he still believes in the one true God. And this will also be his last witness and testimony to all of his descendants who will eventually inherit that land. And just as these type of funeral arrangements are important to Jacob, these type of arrangements should also be important to us as believers, because our funerals and our last wills and testaments, they're also our last witness to our families and to our neighbors. And they should reflect who we are. They should reflect how we believed. And it's very important to leave a good testimony as believers. And it's really important that we can also present the gospel to them, because that's the only thing that will ever give them hope in death. It'll give them comfort to those who are mourning. And so these arrangements, they're so important to Jacob about what happens to his body after his death. He makes Joseph swear an oath, because you have to remember, Jacob believes in a resurrection of the dead. He believes that his body will stand again. And so we see the same type of oath. We had already seen it when Abraham, and he made his servants swear not to take a wife from the Canaanites for his son Isaac. And where Abraham made his servant place his hand under his thigh, which represents the place of covenant, the covenant of God, because that's the area of the mark of circumcision. And you have to remember, Joseph, he also has a part in Abraham's covenant. And even though Jacob knows that he will die in Egypt, he wants to be buried in the land of the covenant promises. near Hebron, and he wants his body to be placed into that burial cave at Machpelah, where Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his father, were there laying in the hope of a resurrection. And so Joseph, he puts his hand under Jacob's thigh, and he swears to him. And then Israel, he bows in gratitude. And then Joseph leaves. But it's not long after that that Joseph is notified that his father's ill. And the thing is, you see, Joseph, he couldn't be with his father every day because he's working. He's running all of Egypt. And Goshen is not very close to the Egyptian cities. And he knows that this may be the very last time that he sees his father. So Joseph, he brings his two sons. And you have to remember, these two sons are half Egyptian. And so Joseph, he sends a message to his dad, Jacob, and he says, I'm coming. I'm on my way. And Jacob here is 147 years old, and he's not able to get around anymore, and he's in pretty bad shape. But when he hears that he's coming, he gets up enough strength to sit up because he wants to give his best image. He doesn't want to look so feeble. And so he's sitting there, and he's leaning on his staff. And everybody knows that this is goodbye. And when people are dying, they don't waste their words and they don't put off important topics because there's no time left to delay. And so Jacob, he starts telling a story. And Joseph, he's heard this story many times before about God appearing to him in Luz. And Luz is Bethel. And that's the first time that God had appeared to Jacob. And this is not just an old man telling the same old story over and over again. This is Jacob telling this story with a purpose. Because what he's doing here is he's passing down the family blessing. And he uses the same exact words that God had given to Abraham and the same exact words that God had given to Isaac. And they're the same exact words that God had spoken directly to Jacob himself. And that was to be fruitful and to be made into a multitude of people. And it was the giving of the land to their descendants. And then what Jacob does is that he lets Joseph know that he's going to receive the double portion of the inheritance. He's going to receive the right of the firstborn. And the way that Jacob is going to do this is by adopting Joseph's two sons and giving them an equal portion among the other 11 of Joseph's brothers. And when Jacob is adopting them, he says that he's adopting them as his first two sons because he compares them to his first two sons. He compares them to Reuben and to Simeon. And so Joseph's two sons, they are given prominence as the firstborn. And you'll always read that it's the 12 tribes of Israel, but actually there's 13 tribes. There is no tribe called the tribe of Joseph. It'll always be two tribes. It'll be the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Manasseh. So every time you read the list of the 12 tribes of Israel, there's always going to be one tribe that is left out. And usually it's the tribe Levi. And that's because Levi became a tribe of priests. And they never received their own special place of inheritance called the land of Levi. They were just giving cities, and they were scattered among all the tribes. And so then Jacob, he tells this story about Joseph's mother, about Rachel, and about her death and about her burial. And though there's only just one little line here about their conversation, I'm going to imagine that they spoke a lot of things about Rachel because both of these men loved her. And they loved her like nobody else loved her because one of them loved her as a son and the other one as a husband. And you have to remember, it's already been over 50 years since Rachel died, but there's something special about speaking about someone who's passed away and that they love that person just as much as you do, and you have these conversations. and nobody else can understand, but you're actually comforted by that other person's love for the same person. Where when you miss them together, you have this special bond. And Jacob, he doesn't have this with anybody else. He doesn't even have it with Rachel's other son, Benjamin, because Benjamin never knew his mom. So this is something special. It's a very special moment that they're sharing. And nobody would be able to understand this moment in the very same way that they do. But you have to see here now, Jacob, he is almost blind. And now he just notices, Joseph's been there for a while, but now he notices that there's other people that are with him, and he couldn't tell who they were. And so he says, well, who are they? Who are these? And even if he could see them, they would look like just a couple of Egyptians. They would look like Joseph because they would have been dressed just like Joseph. They would have been dressed like Egyptian royalty. And Joseph says to him, he says, these are my sons God has given me in this place. And that kind of makes you wonder if Jacob had ever seen them before. But I probably imagine he has. I'm just guessing that Jacob is just getting that blind. And you look at this, these are not little boys. These are both men in their mid-20s. And Joseph here, he's about 56 years old. And Jacob tells Joseph to bring them near, because he wanted to bless them. And what he does is he sneaks in a kiss, because that's what grandparents do. They bring them in and then they sneak a kiss on them. And these boys are raised more like Egyptians than Hebrews. And they may not understand the importance of what's about to happen to them, because you have to remember, these boys have been raised at the highest level of Egyptian society. Their mother is actually the daughter of an Egyptian priest. And so they may want to naturally draw back away from this old man and letting this old man touch them, unless they have some kind of understanding of how great this man is from their father. And so the adoption ceremony, it begins, where Jacob, he stretches out his hands to give this special blessing on Joseph's two boys. And so I imagine this as Jacob, he's sitting there on the bed, and these two boys are standing before Jacob, and they're bowed down. And Joseph, because this is a solemn experience, he's bowed with his face to the ground, and he's not watching where his father is placing his hands. And Joseph is he's placed these boys in their birth order before his blind father. So Manasseh, he's placed at Jacob's right hand to receive the blessing of the firstborn, because the right hand represents the favored position. It's the hand of power. It's the hand of strength. And that's because most of us are right-handed. And Ephraim, he would receive the lesser blessing. He would receive the blessing from Jacob's left hand. And then Jacob, he gives this beautiful benediction. And he's calling on the God of his father, Abraham and Isaac. And then he says, the God that fed me. And the word that he uses there is Jehovah Ra. And what it actually means, the God who shepherded me. And that's the same word that's used for Psalm 23, where it says, the Lord is my shepherd. It's the same exact word, Jehovah Ra. And then he calls this same God the angel who redeemed me, which is the pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. And when he did that to Jacob. And this word redeemed he uses here is the Hebrew word goel. And this is the first time the word redeemed is ever used in the Bible. And he says, and this is that angel that wrestled with him. And that's the one who actually redeemed him. He redeemed Jacob. And the way that he redeemed Jacob was by beating him. He dislocated Jacob's hip, and he forced Jacob to give up, because that was the only time when Jacob surrendered his life to the angel. And then in this adoption, Jacob, he puts the name of his God on these boys. And then when Joseph looks up, he thinks his father's having a senior moment, because Jacob's crossing his hands. And Joseph, he sees his father's right hand on the younger son Ephraim's head. And so Joseph, he goes over there and he physically grabs his hand and he tries to remove his hand and put it on Manasseh. But it's too late. The blessing has been given. And this reminds us of when Jacob stole the birthright blessing, and then when Esau came back to receive the blessing, he said, there's nothing left to bless because God was in it. Nothing could be done now. God was in that blessing because it was of God. And this act, just like that act, it wasn't a senior moment. This was a God moment because God was directing Jacob in what he was doing and where he was placing his hands. Jacob knew who he was blessing because God had shown Jacob that Ephraim, that even though he's the youngest, he's going to be the greater nation. In fact, he'll be the father of nations. And we actually see that later because the tribe of Ephraim becomes the greatest tribe and he becomes the head of all the 10 tribes of the northern tribes of Israel. In fact, those northern 10 tribes, they're called by the name Ephraim. And Joseph, he really shouldn't be surprised by this because God has been consistent about reversing the birth order ever since Abraham's sons. Because you have to remember, Isaac, he was the younger, but he was chosen above Ishmael, the older. And Jacob, he was the younger, and he was given the birthright instead of Esau, the older. And here it's the same. Ephraim is picked. He's picked above his older brother, Manasseh. And that's because God often picks the less likely candidate. That's why he picked most of us. Nobody else would pick us because God, he sees people's hearts. He also sees who has a heart for him. He knows the people that he can work through. And people with birth orders, they think they have some type of right for a position. But in the kingdom of heaven, it's always God's choice, and it's always by his grace. And he always seems to be choosing the lowly. And here by Jacob blessing Joseph's sons, this is how Jacob has truly blessed Joseph. And then the chapter ends with Jacob giving a special piece of land that he said he took from the Amorites with his own bow. The word here for portion, because he says he's going to give them one portion above his brothers, but that word for portion is actually the word Shechem. And we remember Shechem. We remember about Jacob's sons, getting into the war and how God had protected him from the people of Shechem. But this is the first time we ever hear of Jacob ever being a warrior. And so that piece of property that was in Shechem, that actually 500 years later, it does become a piece of property that ends up being an inheritance to the tribe of Ephraim. Okay, so next week, Jacob will bring in the other 11 brothers, and we will see what happens to those boys as Jacob, he prophesies over them. Okay, so here is where we give our call. If you've never been redeemed like Jacob, and if you've never surrendered to the angel, and that angel was Jesus Christ, you need to do that. Today would be a great day to do that. So if anybody, they need prayer for anything, just come grab us or sit in the front pew, or you can go in the prayer room, but the prayer room's hot. It's cool in here. And so if the worship leader would come up and lead us in the last song.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,